He thought humiliating her would be entertaining, but had no idea he was about to lose everything that made him feel untouchable. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The indoor shooting range at Silver Ridge wasn't just a place to practice. It was a proving ground where reputations were built and egos quietly competed under bright fluorescent lights and the faint scent of gun oil lingering in the air. Polished concrete floors reflected rows of neatly arranged lanes, each equipped with high-end equipment that could cost more than a used car, and above it all, a glowing digital leaderboard tracked every shot with ruthless precision. At the very top sat one name that hadn't moved in months, Jake Reynolds. He stood near lane 5, tall, confident, dressed in a fitted black jacket that looked more like it belonged in a luxury showroom than a shooting range. Around him, a small circle of regulars laughed at his comments, nodding at his every word, drawn to the quiet authority he carried. Jake wasn't just skilled, he was known, and in places like this, that meant everything. So when the glass door at the entrance slid open with a soft mechanical hiss, no one paid much attention at first. Not until she walked in. Emily Carter stepped inside wearing faded jeans, a plain gray hoodie, and sneakers that had clearly seen better days. She paused just long enough to take in the space, her eyes moving slowly across the lanes, the equipment, the people, before heading calmly toward the counter. It was subtle, but the shift in the room was immediate. Conversations lowered. Eyes lingered. Judgments formed without a single word being spoken. The receptionist hesitated before offering a polite but uncertain smile. "First time here?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Emily nodded slightly. "Just looking for a lane." Her voice was soft, steady, almost too calm for the environment around her. Behind her, one of the regulars let out a quiet chuckle. Jake noticed her. Then, his gaze sharpening as he looked her up and down, taking in every detail, from her worn clothes to the way she carried herself. There was something about her stillness that didn't quite match the image in front of him, but arrogance is a powerful filter, and it quickly dismissed anything that didn't fit the narrative he preferred. He leaned slightly toward his group, just enough for his voice to carry. "Guess we're expanding membership standards tonight." A few snickers followed, low but deliberate. Emily didn't react. She simply completed her sign-in, accepted the lane assignment, and walked toward the shooting area without looking at anyone. The sound of her footsteps was soft against the floor, almost lost beneath the hum of ventilation systems and distant echoes from other lanes. But to Jake, it felt like an invitation. He stepped forward, crossing the distance with an easy confidence that came from never being challenged. "Hey," he called out, his voice louder now, drawing attention. Emily paused and turned slightly, her expression unreadable. Jake gestured casually toward the lanes. "You sure you're in the right place? This isn't exactly a beginner's class." The room responded on cue, a ripple of quiet laughter spreading outward, subtle but sharp. Phones shifted in hands. Eyes locked in. The moment had begun, and everyone could feel it. Emily met his gaze for a brief second, her eyes steady, almost unnervingly so, then glanced past him at the target's downrange. "I'll manage," she said simply. No attitude, no defensiveness, just quiet certainty. That answer, more than anything, irritated him. Because confidence without permission, especially from someone like her, didn't belong in his world. Jake smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see about that." And somewhere in that exchange, something shifted, something subtle and invisible to most, like the calm before a storm no one realized was already forming. And for the first time that night, the leaderboard above flickered ever so slightly, as if it already knew what was coming. Emily stepped into her assigned lane without another word, the overhead lights casting a clean white glow across the polished surface in front of her, while the digital screen beside her blinked patiently, waiting for input, and behind her the low hum of conversation returned, but now it carried a sharper edge, curiosity mixed with quiet anticipation, because moments like this did not happen often at Silver Ridge, not with someone like her, not in a place where status was measured in precision and consistency. Jake leaned casually against the divider between lanes, arms crossed, watching her with a smirk that had not yet faded, his presence drawing others closer, forming an unspoken audience, each person pretending to adjust equipment or check their scores while their attention remained fixed on Emily Carter. She placed her small range bag on the counter, unzipped it slowly, deliberately, revealing nothing flashy, nothing expensive, just a neatly maintained firearm and a pair of worn gloves, the kind of simplicity that seemed almost out of place among custom grips and engraved finishes worth thousands of dollars. And yet there was no hesitation in her movements, no uncertainty, only a quiet rhythm that felt practiced, familiar. Jake tilted his head slightly, studying her now with a trace of curiosity beneath the arrogance, because something about the way she handled the equipment did not match the story he had already written about her in his mind. But pride is stubborn, and he pushed the thought aside. "You might want to start closer," he said, his tone light but pointed, gesturing toward a shorter distance setting on the console. "Those targets are not forgiving at full range." A few chuckles followed, softer this time, more cautious, as if the room itself was beginning to question the certainty it had so quickly embraced. Emily glanced at the screen, her fingers hovering for just a moment before selecting the farthest distance available, the number appearing in bright digital clarity, and that small decision caused a ripple through the watchers, subtle but undeniable. Jake's smile tightened just slightly, enough that someone paying close attention might have noticed, but no one said anything, because no one wanted to be the first to admit that something felt different. Emily adjusted her stance, feet planted evenly, shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady and controlled, and for a brief second, the entire range seemed to slow, the mechanical hum fading into the background, replaced by a silence that was not commanded but naturally formed, the kind of silence that appears when people sense that something unexpected is about to happen. She lifted the firearm with smooth precision, not rushed, not hesitant, just exact, her eyes locking onto the distant target as if everything else in the room had ceased to exist. Behind her, Jake straightened slightly, his confidence still intact but now sharpened by a need to prove that this moment would end exactly as he expected, because in his world, it always did. "Take your time," he added, louder now, ensuring the audience remained engaged, ensuring the narrative stayed under his control. But Emily did not respond. She did not acknowledge him. She did not even blink. The seconds stretched, each one pulling the room deeper into a quiet tension that no one had planned for. And somewhere in the back, a phone lowered slowly, as if recording suddenly felt less like entertainment and more like witnessing something that demanded respect. The target stood still at the far end, small and distant, almost insignificant to the untrained eye. But to Emily, it was the only thing that mattered, her focus narrowing, her breathing aligning with a rhythm that felt almost invisible. And in that moment, before anything had even happened, before a single shot was taken, the balance in the room had already begun to shift, though no one could yet explain why. And Jake Reynolds, still standing at the center of attention, had no idea that control was quietly slipping from his grasp. The shot had not been fired yet, but something in the air had already changed, a quiet tension stretching across the range like a held breath that no one dared release. And Emily Carter stood at the center of it, unmoving, her posture relaxed but precise, as if she had stepped into a rhythm that the rest of the room could not hear. Her finger rested lightly, not impatient, not forced, just waiting for the exact moment that only she seemed to understand. And then, without warning, the sound cut clean through the silence, sharp and controlled, echoing briefly against the walls before fading into stillness. For a split second, no one reacted, because the mind takes time to process what it does not expect. And then the screen beside her updated, a small digital flash confirming what the eye had not yet fully accepted, a perfect center hit. Exact. Undeniable. The room froze, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. Conversations stopped mid-thought, movements halted, even the faint mechanical hum seemed to retreat, as if it too was waiting for confirmation. Jake blinked once, slowly, his confident expression holding for just a fraction too long before something subtle shifted beneath it. Not doubt yet, but something close enough to make him straighten slightly. Someone behind him let out a quiet, "No way." Barely audible, but enough to ripple through the crowd. Emily did not turn, did not acknowledge the reaction. She simply adjusted her stance again, her movements identical to before, calm, measured, as if the first result meant nothing at all. Jake exhaled through his nose, a short, dismissive breath, forcing a small laugh that sounded more rehearsed than natural. "Beginner's luck," he said, louder than necessary, reclaiming the space with words that were meant to reset the narrative. And a few people nodded quickly, grateful for the explanation, because it restored order, because it made sense. But even as the agreement spread, their eyes remained fixed on Emily, because something deeper refused to settle. She raised the firearm again. The same smooth motion, the same steady focus. And once more, the range seemed to quiet on its own, not out of respect yet, but out of uncertainty. The second shot rang out, just as controlled, just as precise. And this time there was no delay. The screen updated instantly. Another perfect center, aligned so closely with the first that it almost overlapped, leaving no room for interpretation. The silence that followed was heavier now, no longer curious, but undeniable, pressing against the room with a weight that made even the most confident among them shift uncomfortably. Jake's smile faltered, just slightly, the edges tightening as he stared at the display, his mind working quickly to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed. Because people like him do not lose control easily. They explain it away, they reframe it, they wait for the mistake that proves them right. "All right," he said, stepping forward now, his tone sharper. "Try something harder," as if difficulty had not already been chosen, as if he still held the authority to define the challenge. Emily lowered the firearm briefly, her eyes flicking toward the console, and with a simple motion, she adjusted the settings, smaller targets, tighter margins, a configuration that even experienced shooters approached with caution. A murmur spread, quiet but tense, because now there was no comfortable explanation left, no easy dismissal waiting in the wings. Jake folded his arms again, but this time the gesture felt different. Less relaxed, more defensive, though he would never admit it. Not here, not in front of them. Emily lifted the firearm once more, her breathing unchanged, her focus absolute. And in that moment, the room no longer felt like it belonged to Jake Reynolds, or to anyone who had walked in with certainty. It belonged to the outcome that was about to unfold, and for the first time that night, the leaderboard above seemed less like a symbol of dominance and more like something waiting to be rewritten. The third configuration locked into place with a quiet digital beep, smaller targets now appearing on the screen, spaced tighter, less forgiving, the kind of setup that separated casual skill from true control. And a subtle shift moved through the room as people leaned in without realizing it. Their attention no longer casual, no longer amused, but fixed, drawn by something they could not yet explain. Emily Carter did not rush. She never did, her hands steady as she aligned her stance again. Shoulders relaxed, her breathing slow and even, as if the pressure surrounding her existed somewhere far outside her focus. Across from her, Jake Reynolds forced a smirk back onto his face. But it felt thinner now, stretched over a growing tension he could not quite hide, because this was no longer a joke unfolding the way he had planned. This was something else, something that did not follow his rules. "Go ahead," he said, his voice carrying, though it lacked the easy confidence from before. "Let us see how long that streak lasts." And a few scattered laughs followed, hesitant, uncertain, more out of habit than belief. Emily raised the firearm once more, her gaze locked onto the first of the smaller targets, and for a brief second, everything seemed to narrow around her. The lights, the sounds, the presence of others fading into a distant blur, leaving only precision, only control. The shot came clean, sharp, controlled, and the target reacted instantly, center hit, exact, leaving no room for interpretation. This time, there was no laughter at all, only silence, deeper now, heavier. The kind that settles when certainty begins to fracture. She moved to the next target without pause, the transition seamless, as if each action had already been mapped out long before she stepped into the lane. Another shot, another perfect result, the screen updating in real time, each confirmation stacking on top of the last until the pattern could no longer be dismissed. Someone shifted behind Jake, the sound of a shoe against the floor suddenly loud in the quiet. Another person lowered their phone slowly, no longer recording for amusement, but watching with something closer to disbelief. Jake's jaw tightened, just slightly, his arms still crossed, but no longer relaxed. His fingers pressing into his sleeves as if holding on to something that was slipping away, because the room was changing, and he could feel it, even if he refused to acknowledge it. It is just repetition, he said, quieter now, as if explaining it to himself more than anyone else. Anyone can get lucky a few times. But even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow, unsupported by what was unfolding in front of him. Emily adjusted again, her movements identical, precise, controlled, and the third shot followed, then the fourth, each one landing with the same flawless accuracy, each one tightening the silence around them until it became impossible to ignore. The digital leaderboard above flickered softly, recalculating, updating in response to a performance it had not expected to process, numbers shifting, positions changing, and for the first time in months, the name at the top hesitated, as if uncertain whether it still belonged there. Jake looked up instinctively, his eyes locking onto the board, and for a brief moment, something raw crossed his expression, not anger, not yet, but the unmistakable recognition that control was no longer his. Behind him, one of the regulars whispered, barely audible, "That is not luck." And no one disagreed, because by now, the evidence was too clear, too consistent, too precise to be explained away. Emily lowered the firearm slowly, not in triumph, not in acknowledgement, but simply because the sequence was complete, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if she had just finished something routine, something expected. The room remained silent. No applause, no reaction, just a collective pause, as if everyone present was recalibrating their understanding of what they had just witnessed. And in that stillness, the distance between who they thought she was and who she might actually be began to feel impossibly wide. While above them, the leaderboard continued its quiet transformation, inching closer to a shift that no one in that room was prepared to see. The numbers on the leaderboard shifted again, subtle at first, then undeniable. Emily Carter's score climbing steadily with each confirmed hit, inch by inch approaching the position that had belonged to Jake Reynolds for so long that no one had ever questioned it. And now that certainty was unraveling in real time. Jake stared upward, his eyes fixed on the glowing display, his reflection faintly visible against the screen, as if the system itself was forcing him to confront what he could no longer control. And for a brief second, the room felt suspended between what had been and what was about to change. Behind him, the usual low chatter had disappeared completely, replaced by a silence so complete that even the smallest movements carried weight. A shifting stance, a quiet inhale, the soft click of someone adjusting their grip, all amplified by the absence of distraction. Emily remained where she was, calm, composed, her hands lowering the firearm with the same steady precision she had shown from the beginning, as if the outcome unfolding above her was not something she needed to watch, because she already knew. Jake turned back toward her, his expression tightening, searching for something, anything that would restore the balance he had lost. But what he saw only unsettled him further, because there was no arrogance in her, no challenge, no desire to prove anything, just a quiet presence that made everything else feel louder than it should. "You have had your moment," he said, his voice controlled but strained at the edges. "But this is not how it works here." And the words hung in the air, not commanding, not convincing, just an attempt to reclaim authority that was no longer his. Emily met his gaze briefly, her eyes steady, not confrontational, simply present, and in that moment, the contrast between them became impossible to ignore, because where Jake needed the room to validate him, she did not need anything at all. A soft tone sounded from the leaderboard as the system finalized its calculations, and then it happened. The shift completed, her name moving into the top position, pushing his down by a margin that left no room for debate, no room for explanation, only the quiet truth displayed in bright, unchanging numbers. Someone exhaled sharply, another whispered something under their breath, but no one spoke loud enough to break the moment, because they all understood, whether they admitted it or not, that they had just witnessed something rare, something that did not fit into the patterns they were used to. Jake's posture changed, just slightly. The confidence that had once defined him replaced by something less certain, less stable, and for the first time that evening, he had nothing to say. Emily turned back toward her lane, placing the equipment down carefully, her movements unhurried, unaffected by the attention that now surrounded her. And as she reached for her bag, one of the staff members approached cautiously, hesitation visible in every step, as if unsure how to address someone who had just rewritten the hierarchy of the room without raising her voice. "Excuse me," the staff member said quietly. Have you been here before?" It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of everything they had just seen, the need to understand, to categorize, to place her somewhere that made sense. Emily paused for a brief moment, her hand resting lightly on the strap of her bag, then gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "No," she said, her voice calm. "I just needed a place to practice." And that answer settled into the silence with a quiet finality, because it revealed nothing and everything at the same time. Behind her, Jake looked back up at the leaderboard once more, as if hoping the numbers might change again, but they did not. They remained fixed, steady, reflecting a truth he could no longer deny. And as the room slowly began to breathe again, one realization spread quietly among those who had witnessed it. Respect had not been demanded. It had simply been revealed, and in that moment, the space no longer belonged to reputation or appearance. It belonged to something far more undeniable. The room did not return to normal, not immediately, because moments like that do not simply pass. They linger, settling into the space like something permanent, something that quietly reshapes how people see everything that came before it. Emily Carter adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder with the same calm precision she had shown all evening, her movements unhurried, unaffected, as if nothing extraordinary had just taken place. And that, more than anything, made the moment heavier. Because she was not standing there to be recognized, she was already leaving. A few people instinctively stepped aside as she walked past, not out of instruction, not out of habit, but out of something closer to respect, something unspoken but clearly understood, and the path that had once felt like a stage for judgment now opened quietly for her, without a single word. Jake Reynolds remained where he stood, his gaze shifting between the leaderboard and the space she had just occupied, his thoughts moving faster than his expression could follow, because what had happened did not fit into any version of reality he was comfortable with. And for someone who had built his identity on being the best in the room, that realization was not easy to process. He cleared his throat, a small sound that felt louder than it should in the lingering silence, and straightened his posture as if trying to reclaim some part of the authority that had slipped away. But when he looked around, the familiar reactions he relied on were no longer there. No nods of agreement, no easy smiles, only thoughtful expressions and quiet glances that avoided his eyes. One of the regulars shifted uneasily before finally speaking, his voice low but clear enough to carry. She did not even try to show off. And that observation settled heavily, because it pointed to something deeper than skill, something that could not be taught or imitated. Jake let out a short breath, forcing a dismissive shrug that did not quite land. "Anyone can have a good run," he replied. But the words lacked conviction, and everyone in the room knew it. Even him. Near the counter, the staff member who had spoken to Emily moments earlier stood still, replaying the interaction in their mind. The simplicity of her answer echoing louder now than it had at the time. "I just needed a place to practice." And suddenly that sentence felt less like an explanation and more like a quiet statement of truth, one that reframed everything they had just witnessed. Outside the large glass panels, the evening light had softened, casting a muted glow into the range, and as Emily reached the exit, she paused for just a fraction of a second, not turning back, not looking for acknowledgement, simply adjusting her grip on the door before stepping out into the fading light, leaving behind a space that felt different from the one she had entered. Inside, the leaderboard remained unchanged, her name still at the top, steady, undeniable, a silent record of what had taken place, and no one moved to reset it. No one suggested another round, because there was an unspoken understanding that whatever came next would not erase what had already been proven. Jake finally looked away from the display, his reflection fading from the glass as he lowered his gaze. And for the first time that evening, he seemed smaller, not in stature, but in certainty, as if the foundation he had relied on had shifted. Beneath him without warning, the room slowly began to breathe again, conversations returning in low tones, but they carried a different quality now, less about competition, less about status, and more about something quieter, something more reflective. And in that subtle change, one truth remained clear, not announced, not celebrated, but understood by everyone who had been there. That respect does not come from being the loudest or the most recognized. It comes from something far more rare, something that reveals itself only when it no longer needs to be proven. And on that evening, in a place built on precision and performance, it had arrived quietly, without permission, and left just as silently, taking nothing with it, but leaving everything changed. The door had already closed behind Emily Carter, but her presence did not leave with her. It remained, settled into the walls, into the air, into the quiet space between every conversation that tried to restart and could not quite find its rhythm again. Outside, the faint sound of her footsteps faded into the evening, but inside Silver Ridge, something far more lasting had taken root, something that no leaderboard could fully capture. Jake Reynolds stood still for longer than anyone expected, his eyes no longer on the display but fixed somewhere lower, as if replaying the last few minutes in his mind, searching for a mistake that never appeared, because people like him do not lose easily, and when they do not always know how to carry it. One of the regulars stepped closer to the console, glancing up at the scores again, then back toward the entrance, as if expecting her to walk back in and explain it all. But the door remained closed, quiet, final. Who was she? Someone asked softly, not to anyone in particular, but the question hung there, unanswered, because no one knew. And for the first time, that lack of information felt heavier than any explanation. The staff member behind the counter hesitated, then turned toward the system, fingers moving quickly across the screen, pulling up the recent entries, the digital record of everyone who had checked in that evening. And there it was, simple, unremarkable, just a name, Emily Carter, no membership history, no prior visits. Nothing that suggested what they had just witnessed, and that absence of detail only deepened the mystery. Jake exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as if trying to reset himself, then glanced toward the others, expecting, perhaps, some kind of reassurance, some familiar alignment of opinions that would restore the order he was used to. But instead he found silence, thoughtful, measured, no one rushing to defend him, no one rushing to dismiss her. Just a room full of people reconsidering what they thought they understood. It does not make sense, he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. You do not just walk in and do that. But even as he spoke, the certainty he once carried was no longer there, replaced by something quieter, something more uncertain. The staff member looked up from the screen, hesitating before speaking. There is nothing here, they said, almost apologetically. No record, no notes, just her name. And that simple statement settled into the room with a weight that no one could ignore, because it meant there was no easy explanation, no category to place her in, no way to reduce what had happened into something comfortable. One of the younger shooters shifted slightly, glancing between Jake and the leaderboard, then back again, as if seeing both for the first time without the usual assumptions attached. And in that moment, the hierarchy that had once felt so solid seemed far less certain. Jake looked back up at the display once more, his name now sitting just below hers, unchanged, fixed, and for a long moment, he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would undo what had already been shown. The range slowly began to return to motion, people stepping back into their lanes, equipment being adjusted, conversations restarting in softer tones. But something fundamental had shifted, something that would not simply fade with time. And somewhere outside, beyond the glass and steel and controlled environment of Silver Ridge, Emily Carter continued walking, unnoticed, unrecognized by the world she had just quietly disrupted, carrying with her the same calm presence she had always had, leaving behind a room that would remember not just what she did, but how effortlessly she did it. Because in the end, it was never about proving anything to them. It was about revealing something they had forgotten, that true mastery does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. It simply appears, does what it came to do, and leaves others to question everything they thought they knew. The night at Silver Ridge did not end the way it usually did. There was no clear winner celebrating, no familiar rhythm of competition resetting itself for the next round. Instead, there was a quiet unease that lingered long after the last shots had been taken, as if something invisible had shifted beneath everyone's feet and no one quite knew how to step forward again. Jake Reynolds remained near his lane, no longer the center of attention, but still caught in the aftermath of it. His usual confidence replaced by a silence that felt heavier than any words he could have said, and every so often his eyes drifted back to the leaderboard, as if hoping repetition might somehow change what had already been fixed. Across the room, conversations resumed in fragments, low voices exchanging theories, guesses, small attempts to explain what they had witnessed, but none of them landed with certainty, because the truth was too simple and too uncomfortable at the same time. Maybe she got lucky, someone suggested quietly, though the lack of conviction in their voice made the idea collapse before it could take hold. Another shook their head. Not like that. Not that many times. And the discussion faded into silence again, because even speculation required something to hold on to. And there was nothing. The staff member who had checked Emily in earlier stood behind the counter, scrolling through the system once more, as if another look might reveal something hidden, some detail they had missed. But the screen remained unchanged, her name still plain, still ordinary, offering no clues, no titles, no recognition, just a quiet record that she had been there, and then she was gone. Jake finally pushed himself away from the divider, stepping toward his lane with a slow, deliberate movement, the kind that suggested he was trying to return to something familiar, something controlled. But as he picked up his equipment, the weight of it felt different, not heavier, but less certain, as if the confidence that once guided his every motion had been replaced by something he could not quite define. He adjusted his stance, mirrored the same setup he had repeated countless times before, but when he looked downrange, the targets seemed farther away than they had earlier, not physically, but mentally, as if the space between him and them had been quietly expanded by doubt. Behind him, no one gathered, no one leaned in to watch. The audience that had once followed him had dispersed, not intentionally, but naturally, drawn instead to their own thoughts, their own quiet recalibration. Jake lifted his firearm, his movements still precise, still practiced, but lacking the effortless certainty that had once defined him, and for a brief moment, he hesitated, something he had not done in a very long time, because hesitation does not come from lack of skill. It comes from the awareness that skill alone might not be enough. The shot came, controlled, accurate, a strong result by any standard, but as the screen updated, the difference was clear, close, but not perfect, and in that small gap between excellent and flawless, the reality of what had happened earlier became impossible to ignore. Jake lowered the firearm slowly, his eyes lingering on the result, then flicking back up to the leaderboard, where his name remained just below hers, unchanged, steady, a quiet reminder that this was no longer his space in the way it had once been. Across the range, someone watched him for a moment, then looked away, not out of judgment, but out of understanding, because they had all seen it, all felt it. That subtle but undeniable shift where admiration for dominance had been replaced by respect for something far more rare. And outside, beyond the controlled environment of Silver Ridge, the world moved on, as it always did, unaware that inside those walls, a simple woman had walked in, done something extraordinary without ever claiming it, and left behind a room full of people who would never see things quite the same way again. Because sometimes the most powerful moments are not the loudest, they are the ones that arrive quietly, reveal the truth, and disappear before anyone has time to question them. By the time the range lights dimmed slightly to signal closing hours, Silver Ridge had not returned to what it once was, not really, because something had been rewritten in a way that could not simply be reset with a switch or a new round of scores. And even as people packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, their movements carried a quiet reflection, as if each person was still processing a moment that refused to fade into something ordinary. Jake Reynolds remained longer than most, standing near the console where the leaderboard still displayed the final results, his name fixed just below Emily Carter's, unchanged, unchallenged, and for the first time in a long time, he did not reach for an explanation or an excuse, because somewhere deep down, he understood that what had happened was not about chance, not about a single moment, but about something he had overlooked entirely. The staff began their usual routine, checking lanes, powering down systems, but even they moved more quietly than usual, their conversations softer, their glances occasionally drifting toward the screen as if confirming that it was still real. One of them paused briefly before clearing the display, hesitating for just a second longer than necessary, because erasing the numbers felt like erasing something more than data. It felt like closing a chapter that had not fully settled yet. But eventually the screen dimmed, resetting to blank, leaving behind only memory. Jake finally stepped away, picking up his gear with slower movements than before, his posture no longer defined by certainty, but by something quieter, something more grounded. And as he walked toward the exit, he passed the same space where Emily had stood earlier, the same lane where everything had shifted, and for a brief moment, he stopped, not out of pride, not out of resistance, but out of recognition, because he could still see it, still feel it, the calm, the precision, the absence of ego. And in that pause, something within him changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to matter. Outside, the night air was cool, carrying the faint sounds of the city beyond, and as Jake stepped out, he glanced once more through the glass. The reflection staring back at him no longer carried the same certainty it once had, but it carried something else, something quieter, something closer to understanding. Somewhere out there, Emily Carter had already moved on, her evening continuing as if nothing unusual had occurred, her presence blending back into a world that would likely never know what had happened inside those walls. And that was perhaps the most powerful part of it all, because she had not come to prove anything. She had not stayed to be recognized. She had simply done what she was capable of, and left the rest behind. Inside Silver Ridge, the lights dimmed further, the doors closing for the night. But the impact of that evening remained, carried in the thoughts of everyone who had been there, in the quiet shift of perspective that would follow them long after they left. Because sometimes, the most important lessons do not come from loud victories or public recognition. They come from moments that unfold quietly, leaving behind a truth that cannot be ignored. And in the end, it was never about who stood at the top of a leaderboard. It was about what it took to get there, and who did it without needing anyone to notice. Because dignity does not demand attention. It reveals itself when the moment calls for it. And once it does, it changes everything. Respect is always revealed when you least expect it. If you believe in stories that uncover truth and dignity, hit like and subscribe because the next story might change the way you see the world. Thank you for watching.